Welcome, everybody. I'd like to thank you for coming, and I'd like to say a little bit about Datto and why Attain chose Datto. Mike DePalma is from Datto, and he's going to do the presentation for us today. And one of the reasons I chose Datto is because before Datto, we would have a customer with a server emergency, a data emergency, and it'd be always a panic. Check the backups, make sure that they're good, or make sure that we have the most current version. And all of that stress and fear goes away with Datto because we know we're checking those backups on a daily basis. Datto has automated processes that check. They check ransomware and stuff like that. I'm not going to go through all the details of Mike's product because he's going to go through that for us. But by far, Datto brings ransomware resiliency to us so we never have to pay the ransomware. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
All right, thank you. So my name is Mike DePalma. I'm the Senior Channel Development Manager for North America here at Datto. My role is a little bit unique in that I'm not on the sales team. I'm not even on the marketing team. We have a separate team that just goes around and does these educational webinars. I'm actually, as you can see, I'm on the road right now at a cyber resiliency event with a bunch of different vendors and really interesting stuff and panels that we're seeing. And so a lot of those stories that we're going to talk about to kind of set the stage in terms of what cyber resiliency is, they come from these kind of conversations. I've been fortunate enough to present alongside folks from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, some state organizations. So within that, a lot of the stats and the stories that are coming out of there are coming directly from these organizations. So just very briefly about Datto. So we're in our 14th year now. As was mentioned, we're a business continuity provider based out of Norwalk, Connecticut. So about 40 miles east of Manhattan. It's been great to be part of this growth, and really what it was is there's a lot of great business continuity solutions at the enterprise level, and there was really no solutions at the small to medium-sized business community that were priced appropriately. So we got in very early, and now we see that that's really becoming the standard. The trend is this business continuity as opposed to just traditional backups. Approaching 2,000 employees worldwide. We do have 23 offices beyond that headquarters that I mentioned. And we also have 9 private data centers around the world. We've got one in Reading, Pennsylvania, and one out in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'll get into the importance of those locations, but it's very important to note that obviously the data stays within the country. We've got 2 up in Canada, we've got 4 in Europe, but also noting that this is military grade encryption in transit and at rest in that cloud into what's called an immutable cloud, which means that the data cannot be changed there. So I know there will always be questions about that, but we control the data centers. Again, it's one of the largest private data centers in the world. And if you want to Google an exabyte, you'll see how many zeros are behind that, but it's a large amount of data. So I'll set the stage like this. I'm a little bit of a history nerd. This is, I'm on the road all the time. This is what I'm reading books on and things like that. So I like to put things into the historical perspective of where we are right now, because if you look at the course of human history, there have always been these points in time where there was a big technological advancement that propelled us forward, the Stone Age, the Industrial Revolution. When historians look back at right now, clearly we are in the digital revolution age, the data-driven age. And the bad news from all of these different stages is that there are always bad actors on the other side exploiting these same technologies for their own benefit. And we're seeing that more than ever. And these are very opportunistic folks. And unfortunately, a lot of the best and the brightest actually move over to the dark side because it's so lucrative and there's very little risk of catching these guys. When we think about the concept of cyber resiliency, there's a kind of mindset shift. Cybersecurity has always been something that should be top of mind, right? We're going to prevent all these attacks from getting in. But cyber resiliency looks at it as, yeah, that's a piece of it, cybersecurity. But if something does get through, how quickly can you detect that an attack has occurred? And then how resilient is your business, not just to get your data back, but get your whole business back into a production environment. And it's kind of cliche as it sounds. It does start with the people. It really, if you don't have complete buy-in and that culture of security built into your company through trainings, through having a very detailed policy, it doesn't necessarily matter what your technology is because they could still make mistakes. Same with the processes. I'll give you a real life example. One of our partners talked about a new client that they had. Prior to, they just installed multi-factor authentication. Great conversation to have. When I log in, I've got to type in my credentials, goes to my cell phone. I do facial recognition. Now I have access to all of my tools, right? So this particular business, they implemented MFA. Great idea. They went through a little mandatory 30-minute training. the very first weekend that they implemented this, the CEO of the company was out at the park with his family and gets an alert. Did you just try to sign in? And he clicked yes. He needed to get that off of his phone as quick as possible because he was taking pictures. So again, the great technology, which is multi-factor authentication, still requires the proper training and all the rest. So I just want to point that out. You've got to make sure all three of these silos are checked off, or you're really running some risk of not being as cyber resilient as you might think you are. There's most of the stories about these attacks, they come from large splashes on the internet, the city of Baltimore, the pipeline that just happened, right? All of these large insurance companies, that's what makes the news. So when you talk to small, the medium-sized businesses, a lot of times there's two reactions. There's well, why would they attack me? I don't have any real important proprietary data. That's just happening at the large level. Or you throw your hands up and say, look, the US government just got attacked. How am I going to possibly combat these folks? But there are ways to do it. There are ways that I could tell you specifically about with some of these incidents of what they could have done. And there's some vulnerabilities on the front end, but also that resiliency side. But I like the stories, the large stories, because they give us hard numbers. It's not a theoretical what might happen because they're public companies, or municipalities, they've got to disclose that. So when the city of Baltimore was hit, this was about 2 years ago, they were asked for essentially $75,000 in Bitcoin. They're almost always going to ask for the money in some form of cryptocurrency. They're not going to ask for an ACH. They're not going to ask for a credit card payment because they know it goes out in cryptocurrency. It's very difficult to track where that's going, if not impossible. But so they don't. So they've got the $75,000 ask sitting on their desk. Government's policy is not to pay the ransom. So the city of Baltimore decided not to. Plus, the city of Baltimore, huge, robust IT team with a huge budget. At the end of the day, it took them weeks to get all of their systems back up online. And they had to go back to the city and essentially ask for $18 million because that's what the actual impact is. And this is scalable. And this is the math that the criminals want you to do. Pay me my $75,000 in ransom or call me in 4 weeks when you now have an $18 million impact. And oh, by the way, that $75,000 just became $200,000 because the timer's been ticking, right? So that's the math that they really want you to do. Again, comes into cyber resiliency. They weren't really prepared to deal with an attack like this. They didn't do disaster recovery tests. They didn't know how quickly they can get back up and running. And so I mentioned the government stance on this, and they've always publicly said it. If I'm on webinars with them, they will say the reasons not to pay the ransom. It emboldens these folks. It actually puts a bigger bullseye on your back. There's a new study out that shows that close to 90% of businesses that were attacked with ransomware will get attacked again. Criminals, they know they can get through once. Let's see if you've changed anything. And so the government put out an official statement, the Treasury Department. And what they said was, it's actually, you're actually at risk of violating the law by paying these ransoms. And it's not illegal to pay a ransom. I mean, people think it might be, but the payment of a ransom is not illegal. But the problem is a lot of times the folks behind these attacks, they are terrorist organizations. They are enemy nation states. And so by paying the ransom, you're inadvertently funding one of these organizations or states that are on the terrorist list, which is obviously violating the law. Now, this statement doesn't have a lot of teeth to it because, again, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to track exactly where that specific payment went. But it shows you the direction that the government's going in. They could put all the regulations in the world and that they want. It's not going to help to stop getting these guys in or even helping to catch these guys. What it really does is it shifts the burden over to the business community. It says it's your responsibility to protect your data, your client data, your employee data, because if you are attacked, hopefully you survive. Hopefully you're one of the lucky ones that keeps your door open. But we're still going to come knocking on your door to see exactly what you had in place prior to. Make sure you were checking off those boxes based on these regulations, and also making sure that you didn't pay the ransom. And so this just shows you that you really need to be proactive with this stuff because when it happens, you have to be prepared to have those conversations. And I mentioned the bigger bullseye on your back. They get through once. What do? The city of Baltimore spent $18 million remediating the problem. They didn't put procedures in place to prevent that next attack. So what happened in the fall of this last year during the craziness of everybody, homeschooling and all the rest? Well, the school system got hit. And this wasn't necessarily an attack to say, hey, I know I'm going to get this money. It was more, in my opinion, the attack, the benefit to the criminals was that they made two news stories. And now they're telling the business community and all of the states, hey, we can get in whenever we want. So we got in once, we'll get in again. So it wasn't necessarily the idea of, hey, I got these folks to pay $10,000, I'm going to attack them again. They didn't get paid the first time, and they still attacked the second time. So one of those things, you really got to make sure you remediate the problem. And I think it's important to talk about who we're up against here, because it's not the kid in his parents' basement anymore, or some guy who doesn't want to get a real job. When the pipeline attack occurred, you started reading some more detailed stories of these folks that are behind it. And they're actually kind of, it's a corporate structure to some extent. It's what's called ransomware as a service, where the really smart folks create these variants of ransomware or any kind of malware, and they sell them off to what I would refer to as the sales team. These are the guys actually going out and doing the attacks. There's even, to some extent, a support group that will pop in. You don't have a Bitcoin account? Don't worry, we'll walk you right through how to do that. Or they'll pose themselves as, hey, we can remediate this for X amount of money. I just think it's important to note, this is the structure we're under. There are buildings on Earth right now where somebody's sitting there in front of a desk perpetrating attacks, and then they go and they have their break and they go talk about Game of Thrones with their coworkers, and then they punch out at 5 o'clock and go home to their families. There are people that are actually doing that as a living and not even thinking of themselves as criminals because they're in a cubicle somewhere. We do still see some insider threats. We saw a little uptick last year on that, where there's somebody maliciously internally doing some of these attacks. I believe that was just because of the chaos we were seeing and the uncertainty and the panic that a lot of employees were having. It makes up a small percentage, but I did want to just note that that's in there. People don't think of organized crime as being behind these attacks. That is exactly what they're doing when there's easy money to be made with very little risk of getting caught. It's not the Sopranos and Goodfellas anymore. This is what these folks are doing here in the States, Russia, China, Europe. Again, they're going to follow that money and make sure they get a hand in that. I mentioned those nation states. We could put all the sanctions in the world on these folks. They're going to find ways to make money. This is one of the ways they do it. And they put a lot of resources into that. So it's important to note that. And then the last one is this Internet of Things idea where everything's connected, right? So first thing in the morning, I ask Alexa what the weather's going to be, so on and so forth. Well, I'll tell you, another little homework assignment. You go and you Google one of the most lucrative casino heists ever pulled. And it actually was just a couple of years ago, 2017. And this was not guns ablazing going into the casino. They were able to find a vulnerability in the internet connected fish tank thermometer in this casino, those big fancy fish tanks, and then infiltrate the network and extract all the personal and financial information from the high rollers. This is information worth millions of dollars on the dark web. So it just goes to show you one of the things of putting together a cyber resiliency plan. You're starting on the front end. When you think about people, it's not just about training. It's about, let's find out who has access to what. Who has access? Does everybody that needs admin access have them? But did we just carte blanche let everybody have access to everything? That's where it starts, doing this inventory of not only where your physical devices are, how protected those are, but who has access to what. So if we are attacked, where is that going to migrate to? And where are those vulnerabilities? So a gap analysis is critical. Now, Datto lives in the world of cyber attacks. I've been talking about ransomware as a service for 6 years now. 6 years ago, I'd get a couple of head nods, people looking at their phones. This was something they might have read a story or two about. Now people are paying attention. Now they want this information, these stats. And we've done a ransomware specific study each of the last 5 years, focusing on the small to medium-sized business community, so that we had our own numbers. They're confirmed by third party, but we want to have our own numbers. And what we saw in 2020 was that there was clearly an uptick in attacks on the healthcare industry. Who had more pressure on them last year than the healthcare industry? Shows how opportunistic they are. Once hurricane season hits the Southeast, they're going to shift and they're going to go and focus their attacks on folks down there, because there's going to be chaos and people are working remote and their guards are let down and all the rest. But what's more important about this chart is if you look through it, every single industry is on here. They're able to cast this huge wide net because, again, they don't necessarily care what your data is. They're encrypting it and they're just saying, I'm holding it hostage, because they know, regardless of what industry you're in or the size of your business, nowadays you can't operate without it. And so they know that they're going to get folks to pay. So it allows them to go down market in the small business community, but they also know they're going to have a higher success rate of not only getting through, but getting those small businesses to pay. We saw the city of Baltimore at $18 million impact. Now the city of Baltimore can't go out of business, but businesses typically aren't able to survive that. The way they're getting in is still pretty similar. It hasn't really changed that much. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So they're just still sending out phishing emails, and they're getting really, really good. I screen grab them. We have a Slack channel here at Datto to look at some of the good ones, but they're really good. It's not the the guy, your long lost uncle saying, hey, send me $10,000, I'll make you a millionaire in my will. Those get either caught up in your spam box or you clearly know that they're fake. These are, when you hear the term social engineering and socially engineered spear phishing attacks, we give so much information freely on the internet. I mean, we almost have to, right? Go to my LinkedIn profile. You could see how long I've been at Datto, where I was prior, where I went to school. A criminal can now look at that and say, okay, he's got his 20-year college reunion coming up. Probably gets a ton of emails from the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association. Well, this one's going to look exactly like those. It's going to have a hyperlink in there. And it's going to say, click here to find out all the information you need about the 20-year reunion festivities. And they're going to then get me to click on it because it looks like every other email in my inbox. They're really good. And they're, again, when I talk about them being opportunistic, we saw emails within days of the pandemic really, getting some traction that looked like they came from the CDC, World Health Organization. Click here if you have any of these symptoms or cases in your area. They can pivot on a dime. And so they're very opportunistic there. But it's important to note, this goes back to your people within your organization. To the multi-layered cyber resiliency piece, when we talk to businesses that were attacked, close to 60% of them had anti-malware filtering in place. A lot of them had the endpoint detection. Doesn't mean that that should not be part of your cybersecurity plan. It just shows that it has to be multi-layered. When FBI Director Wray was on the floor of Congress a few weeks ago getting grilled about the attack on the government, he was open and said, nobody could look you in the eye and say you were 100% secure from the attacks that are happening now and the ones that are happening tomorrow. So it does come back to, or if it does get through, how quickly can I detect that? And then how quickly can I get back into operation? Because the real pain from this is the loss of productivity. You go back to that pipeline attack. What was the real impact? It wasn't the fact that they were losing data or couldn't get their data back. It was the downtime. It was the fact that it was over a week before they could run their systems. Gas is still over $3 a gallon up here in Connecticut. That is the impact that we're seeing. It's the loss of productivity. And I can remember going over the stats from the report back in 2018. Average ransomware payment was only $4,300. The actual impact, 10 times higher, over $46,000, a big number. Look at where that trend has gone in the last 2 years. Now, according to our report, the average impact from a ransomware attack on a small business, $300,000. It easily becomes a seven-figure impact when you start getting larger or you're a highly transactional company. I did a recent webinar with a gentleman from the FBI. He mentioned that their number was actually 1.6 million. And another one from the Department of Homeland Security. Now they're really strict about sharing their slides. I wish I could have it so that I could share it with you, but he said it publicly. Their average length of downtime that they're seeing on a business that's impacted by ransomware, 16.2 days. Start to put that in perspective of what 16.2 days of downtime would do to your bottom line. When FEMA put out a study about the folks impacted by hurricanes last year, the number was 40% that were impacted and down for a week or more were closed within 12 months. So the criminals know that. That's why they get people to pay. It's because of that downtime. It's this math that they want you to do. And, when we talk to the small business community and we say, how concerned are you about this? Only 3 in 10 business owners in our survey said they were highly concerned about ransomware, despite the fact that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, that we saw even an uptick in 2020 because of all the chaos going on. 7 out of 10 business owners still aren't highly concerned. The criminals love this. They don't have to change anything that they're doing because it's working and people aren't taking it seriously. The scary part about this, 2019, that number was 41%. We are all in the IT space doing something wrong if that number now comes down to 30%. So we need, as a whole community, to really understand the only way we're going to win this fight is for everybody to understand the threat actors that are behind it and ways in which you can, protect your data. That number has to come up. And that's why it's great that, we have so many attendees on this webinar, because it's showing that there is some interest in it. And so when we look at that pipeline attack, they paid the $4 million and they were still down for over a week. I would love to get the number of what that actual impact is. It might not ever come out, but the actual impact to their bottom line is going to be astronomical. It's going to be in the tens of millions of dollars probably. An insurance company actually paid out recently the largest payment that we know of a ransomware attack, $40 million. We have to make sure that we don't have to pay the ransom. And when we look at really what a disaster looks like on both ends, these are 2 acronyms that I think are very important to this conversation, and 2 that the criminals definitely know, and that's what we will address in cyber resiliency. The RPO side is how much data you're at risk of losing. How often are you taking your backups? Are you testing them? Is it hourly? Okay, well, then you're saying your RPO is an hour, and maybe that's aggressive enough for you. Highly transactional companies might need to be more aggressive, but the criminals know that's their first piece of leverage. They've got your data. If you don't have any backups, we got no other recourse but to pay or close your doors. But they know a lot of businesses are backing it up. So the real impact, the real reason that they get folks to pay is the right-hand side of the screen. That's your recovery time objective. How much downtime would you incur? Would it be a day, a week, the 16.2 days? You need to be able to answer that question. That's the cyber resiliency side. So the goal here is to figure out what your RTO needs to be, and are you hitting that RTO number, your recovery time objective? Important piece to this. And so to focus on that, and that's really where the business continuity solution that Datto provides comes into play, is it looks at backup a little bit differently. There's really a mindset shift from backup to business continuity. Backup has been, the kind of commoditized. It's backing up the files and the folders that you're asking it to, whether it's an on-premise device or in the cloud. But at the end of the day, you've got these files and folders. Business continuity looks at it a little bit differently. It's a full image of that server or even critical workstation that captures all the files and folders, so there's no volumes being missed, but also the operating system, the applications, everything that lives on that server is mirrored over to an on-premise device and then subsequently sent off to those two data centers. The way that the backups occur are different as well. So you're going to sit down and you're going to have a conversation about, what your RPO needs to be. Maybe it's hourly. Okay, we're going to set up this schedule. These backups are going to go along automatically. But what's happening is it's not a full backup every single hour, which would be sending a ton of data to the cloud. It's just looking at the block level incremental changes, basically the changes that are occurring between those 2 points in time. And so it gives us the ability to create what's called an inverse chain. One of the things you'll read about is that criminals are not only trying to get into your server, but go and attack your backup as well. What happens with an inverse chain is all of those backup points, they're independent of one another. So if you're hit at 11 o'clock, there's no risk of a 10 o'clock backup being impacted. So that's critical. And again, it's encrypted once it heads off to the cloud in transit and at rest. So what this allows us to do beyond just the inverse chain is this actually helps us detect ransomware, going back to that cyber resiliency piece, because these backups are going along. They all look relatively similar. When a ransomware attack occurs, we're not looking at individual variants because there's new ones coming out every hour, but this is instead looking at the footprint that it leaves. We had a group of engineers sit in a room and just get real life viruses from the dark web and attack servers to see what it looks like. And basically all these files and folders change all between these 2 points in time. It's going to jump off the screen and create an alert saying, this looks like every ransomware attack we've seen. And here's your last clean backup before we started seeing that. But ultimately, what this does is it changes your mindset of what you need to do after an attack. All right, so Jim down the hallway doesn't do his training, clicks on an email he's not supposed to, encrypts his machine, it's now migrated to the server he has access to. Your first reaction now is not to say, all right, we need to get rid of this server and get a new one in place and start restoring that data. Your first reaction is, I have to get everybody back up and running in my office. And what can happen is now, because everything that lived on that server is mirrored over to this on-premise device, you can set up what's called now a virtual machine. And this is operating as your server. Everybody that had access to that server that's been encrypted now has access to this. If it's happening at the local level, most folks won't even know that occurred. They're going to have access to all the tools that they need. And so they're now being productive. You're taking active backups in this state, while that server that was infected is being, replaced, or there's some forensics being done on it. And you could be in this virtualized state for hours, days, weeks. And again, it's business as usual. And when you do get that new piece of hardware in place, now you're getting your systems and your data back, not to where you were when Jim clicked on that email, but instead where you were the minute you were ready to start restoring that data. And you could actually start the restoration process while you're still in the virtualized state. So the idea here is we've got to close this downtime gap. 16.2 days is not something that most businesses can incur, right? So what this does is now you're talking about minutes or hours to get systems back up and running. Back in the good days when I was traveling, I'm starting to do it again. We used to do disaster demos. They were fun. We'd light things on fire. We'd smash things with hammers and say, okay, this clearly isn't going to work anymore. But I'm going to pull my presentation back up by spinning up a virtual instance of that. And with a data set like that, it's 30 seconds and we're back up and running. That's the type of business continuity solution you need to have when you're thinking about cyber resiliency. You want to be able to answer those RTO and RPO questions. And as was mentioned, every one of those backups is not only tested, but the offsite sync is tested as well. And all the virtualization capabilities are tested every single night. There's a technology called screenshot verification that we created, which essentially brings up that instance in the background every single night, brought up to a boot screen. You see the timestamp on it to let them know that, yes, you can boot this server from the device. And ultimately, you could do that locally or from either one of our data centers. The reason why we chose those locations is simple. They're on opposite sides of the country. What you want to have geo redundancy as much as possible, because yes, the vast majority of this downtime occurs because of data loss and downtime and things like that. We do see natural disasters wipe out a business and need to operate. And so at any given time, we've got thousands of businesses operating out of our data centers for various reasons. And so this really takes that to the next step. Well, if you've now closed that downtime gap to a point where it makes more sense to not pay the ransom, you've taken away both pieces of leverage from these criminals. Think about the pipeline. If they were able to still run their systems while they were trying to get that data back, we wouldn't have seen a week's worth of downtime, right? We would have seen a few hours or maybe a day with that much data to get everything back up and running. The impact would not nearly have been as severe. So that's kind of where that fits in. Hopefully this was helpful, but I want to open it back up to questions. Feel free to jump in. So I don't know if you want to jump in as well. I'll stop my screen share as well so we can see our faces here. So Bob, you have anything to add on that? I'm sure you've got some stories, scary stories and all the rest.
Well, I'll tell you, we've had a couple disasters that clients' servers have died with Datto, and I can see we've never actually had to use ransomware, this in a ransomware attack, because we try to do preventive maintenance as well. But one of the things I can say is that the downtime recovery, we had a server completely crash, and we had the server back up and running in 20 minutes flat. And the end users didn't even know, because the server went down before they got in the morning. So they didn't even see outage. And someone forgot to tell the client. And 2 weeks later, we had to tell a client, oh yeah, by the way, you're on a disaster recovery device. They had no clue. So that's the continuity of business that we provide. And that's the thing. The other piece is that ransomware detection piece in Datto, it works. We've had it go off once, and it saved our bacon, because it went off before the ransomware took hold, and we were able to catch it before it hit the server. So,
yeah, I think it's important to know. I mean, we talk about cybersecurity, cyber resiliency. This is not a product you can go buy and say, okay, now I made an investment. This is an ongoing plan that needs to be in place, and as Bob can attest to, I mean, there's a lot of new technology coming out every week. There's a bunch of vendors at this event that I'd never heard of before, which is great. And so it needs to be addressed, and making sure that, all the integrations are there and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why, we're seeing a big shift of folks like Bob working with businesses that even have an internal IT team. It's one of those things that really outsourcing and working with a third party, both on making sure that your plan is right and in place, but also, you have the technology on the background to make things, secure.
Another thing I want to point out too is that Datto invests a ton of money. They have their chief security officer hold webinars with MSPs, teaching us what we need to know every day. And they're also looking at things. A couple of years ago, Datto made a change when they saw something changing in the industry, and they started making it so that we can stop deletion of data in the second data center to prevent ransomware people from gaining access to the data center and deleting the data. So they're always staying above and on top of those things that need to be done with the current trends that the hackers are doing, because the hackers will change. As soon as we block them for something else, they're either trying to find a way around it or try to find another way. So it's a shell game. I don't know if you agree, Mike, but
100%. And then we'll find that data wherever it lives. We saw it's a different conversation, but we saw a huge uptick in attacks on software as a service applications, Microsoft 365, that type of stuff. And you move to the cloud, it's great. Well, that data needs to be protected, because there are ransomware attacks specifically to Microsoft 365, to Dropbox. Again, when you take that inventory and put together a plan, You have to know where all of your data lives. If it's any critical data, how is it being secured on the front end, but is it being backed up? Because even Microsoft will tell you to use a third-party backup for their stuff.
Well, I would have to thank you. We don't have any questions, Mike, so I think we're good. Everybody, thank you for coming. And Mike, thank you for doing the presentation. I really appreciate it. And I know you got a conference to go to, so.
Put my sports coat back on. Well,
there you go.
There you go. Thank you for having me. This was great. Hopefully this was helpful, and we did record it. So there's other folks within the office that want to take a look at it. Reach out to Bob. He can get you a copy.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.